Welcome to the Atlantic Council on International Relations webinar on a path to democracy to preserve regional security. As many of you know, Venezuela has fallen from one of the richest countries in Latin America to one suffering from economic and social crisis that threatens nearly 32 million people. Its GDP has plummeted even more than the United States did during the Great Depression. Many of its inhabitants are unable to afford food, and many of its hospitals lack the basics like soap and antibiotics. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us Ambassador James Story, a career diplomat with extensive experience in Latin America, to help us better understand what's happening in Venezuela and how Venezuela might find its way back to the prosperity its people so deserve. So a great big welcome, Ambassador Story. Thanks so much for being with us today. And a big welcome to each and every one of you who have joined us via this Zoom. To many members of the ACI who are with us today, it has been a long 9 months since we had an opportunity to enjoy each other's presence in getting together at our breakfast and luncheon meetings. However, it is my hope that with the vaccines soon coming to us, there may be some light at the end of this tunnel. We hope to resume limited in-person meetings, perhaps in late spring. To those non-members who have joined us today, if you enjoyed today's program, you may wish to check out our website at www.atlantacir.org for our future programs. Also, a great big welcome to our special guest, Ambassador Charles Shapiro. Ambassador Shapiro served as the United States Ambassador to Venezuela from 2002 to 2004 and is currently President of the World Affairs Council in Atlanta. It is a great pleasure, Charles, to have you with us, and I'm so glad that you've agreed to join. And a welcome to all of those of you from the Atlanta Consular Corps. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Bill Bozart, who will introduce our speaker. Bill, you've got it.
Thank you, Bob. As you said, Venezuela is one of the most troubled countries, certainly probably the most in the Western Hemisphere. And with all of the attention in the US news on COVID-19 and the presidential election, it's been easy to overlook these important parts of the world. So we're honored today to have the person from the US State Department who probably knows more about Venezuela than anybody else in that organization. Because of the instability of the country, we had to close our embassy in Caracas, and he's been operating as the chargé d'affaires for the Venezuelan affairs units located in Bogota, which is where he's going to speak to us from today. And only yesterday, as recently as last night, the process to become officially the ambassador to Venezuela was completed. So again, this is a significant day. We may be the first group that he's presented to in that title. In addition to his work in Colombia and in Venezuela, he's had other posts in Latin America and South America. He was the US Consul General in Rio de Janeiro, and also served as the director of the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Office in the Western Hemisphere. And he's had other assignments. He was in Mozambique and also in the United Nations in New York. And he's received numerous awards for his service over the years. And we are in it for a treat today. I know you're going to find Mr. Story very down to earth. He's insisted that we refer to him as Jimmy, which seems to be a little light for that of a full ambassador, but nonetheless, we will honor that. He is a son of the South, like myself and many of us on the call today. He grew up in a small town near Charleston, completed much of his undergraduate work at South Carolina. And so, Jimmy, before turning it over to you, I just want to say I'm so sorry that our Bulldogs have manhandled the Gamecocks so many times over the years. And unlike a lot of people in the southeastern part of the United States, we are not solely interested in college football. We are very interested in international affairs. So we are delighted to have you with us today to talk about your experience and what the future may hold in terms of Venezuela. So take it away, Jimmy.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Bill. I appreciate that. And to Sherry and Dr. Kennedy, Tony, Ambassador Shapiro, to whom you were referring when you talked about having somebody on today who knew a lot about Venezuela, he certainly does. Regarding college football, I have to say Gamecocks per win must be the best fans in the country. And notwithstanding this year's season, there's always hope for next year. Listen, guys, I'm really excited to be here and thank the Atlantic Council for the opportunity. I think we're have a great discussion in front of us, I hope, and I will attempt to keep my remarks to about 15, 20 minutes, maybe 25. And I want to walk y'all through a little bit about how we got where we are and then talk about where we're going. And you are indeed the first group I had the pleasure and honor of addressing as the U.S. Ambassador to Venezuela. Certainly my confirmation hearings and my confirmation last week, my giving over the credentials on yesterday caused some consternation with the Maduro regime, and that's just fine by me. But let me back up a little bit and just let you know how we got where we are. And you heard a little bit about my resume, and I had the opportunity to run counter-narcotics in Colombia and then run counter-narcotics in the Western Hemisphere. And the State Department said, well, where do you want to go next? And I served twice in Brazil already. And I said, listen, I was in Afghanistan, then I did this. It's been a long 6 years. I'd love to be Consul General in Rio. And they said, okay, great. Yeah, you got it. And the Olympics, I knew it would be a hard year, but then Brazil kind of fell apart on me. It was a difficult 3 years. It wasn't all sitting on the beach enjoying life, I can assure you. And at the end of my 3 years, as I was looking for my next assignment, and Ambassador Shapiro, certainly he'll know about this. They said, well, we hope you enjoyed your time in Brazil. And I said, wait a second. It was very difficult. They said, that sounds great. Well, you could choose between Cuba and Venezuela. And I chose Venezuela and took the opportunity to go there. Unfortunately, right as I was leaving Brazil, there were fraudulent presidential elections in May of 2018. And they were considered fraudulent by the vast majority of the international community. And our charge d'affaires there, our chief of mission there, I should say, Ambassador Todd Robinson, was very outspoken. And he and the deputy chief of mission were asked to leave the country. They were PNG'd by the Maduro regime. So my phone call came in and they said, you have about a week to learn everything you can learn about Venezuela, and then we want you down there as a charge. And I arrived just because of visas and everything else, and leaving Brazil, finishing up in Brazil, arrived after a couple of weeks, and I got there in late July of 2018. And I want to set the scene for you all because I think there are a lot of folks that are trying to figure out, well, as we think of policy prescriptions, how did we get where we are and how do we move forward from where we are today? I arrived, I attempted to work a fine line between being outspoken but not directing my comments necessarily at the Maduro regime and not staying in a defensive crouch. I was pretty outspoken. We worked very closely with the Department of State, of course, the National Security Council and others as we started defining or redefining how our approach would be. And we moved towards a maximum pressure campaign that slowly built up speed or steam over a period of time. But let me be clear, sanctions had been started all the way back in 2014, 15, some more sanctions that were against individual people in 16, 17. And then we had some sanctions that went after bank accounts and went after kind of the predatory nature of the Maduro regime. And as we moved forward along in that line, I began meeting with all of the various political parties and players in the country. In fact, in October of 18, I started a Wednesday morning phone call that I've had every single Wednesday since October of 2018 with the big four political parties. They're called the G4, and they have the vast majority of the seats, or a significant majority of the seats, and a significant majority of the power, political power, inside of the country. And I also met with a group of young people. We call them the 2007 generation. And in that group of young people was a young guy named Juan. And now he's known as Interim President Guaido. but I knew him before he was Guaido. I knew him as Juan. And we struck up a significant, deep friendship relationship, which continues to this day. In January of 19, we sanctioned the oil industry in Venezuela. It's important to remember that date because you will hear from the regime on a daily basis that we are the cause of all the suffering in Venezuela. And ladies and gentlemen, let me be very clear. I had the opportunity to visit hospitals. I went into the barrios, the ranchos, we call them favelas in Brazil, and meet with people. I worked across that country in the 9 months I was on the ground, and we're not the reason that Venezuela is having the largest humanitarian crisis outside of civil war or active war, with the largest displacement of persons outside of war as well. So in January, we hit their oil industry, but it was already in significant decline. It had gone from 4 million barrels a day production, perhaps when Ambassador Shapiro was there, to something on the order of 800,000 barrels. A lot of that mismanagement, lack of investment, and of course, just the theft of what we calculate as $300 billion, and I think that's conservative, of money, most of it coming out of that PDVSA piggy bank, the oil industry piggy bank inside of Venezuela. About 96% of their income comes from oil. So we hit the oil industry at that point, and we've slowly tightened the screws over a period of time. Now in January, they had an election for the new president, for the new president of the National Assembly, who assumed office on the 5th of January of 2019. And over the course of a couple of weeks, it became clear that they were looking at an article. I could get really wonky here, but I'll try not to. And as Bill pointed out, I did go to University of South Carolina, so I don't have to get wonky. But we had there are articles inside of the Constitution that indicate that if the presidency has been vacated, that there is a mechanism by which the president of the National Assembly assumes a vacated presidency, and that's what happened. Guaido didn't self-proclaim himself president. He didn't say I'm president. He assumed a vacated presidency, which, according to Article 233 of the Constitution, was his necessary duty. He could have not said I can't do it. He had to do it. And again, because the May 2018 election for president was a complete farce, complete fraud. And what happened just now on Sunday was also a complete farce and a complete fraud. And I'll explain all the reasons why that it was. But before I get there, I want to tell you what happened on that day of January 23rd, if memory serves, in 2019. We knew that we were going to recognize President Guaido. And I'm letting you into a little story here to give you a sense of how things were. So I had my small team inside of our bubble, we call it, where we have our private conversations. And we had already, I was on the phone with the White House when he took the oath of office in front of a large crowd in downtown Caracas. And as soon as he said, I swear, I told the White House. And within a couple minutes, we had already indicated that we recognized him as a legitimate president of Venezuela. Well, you can imagine that this did not please Maduro, nor his inner circle. But while we were in our small bubble talking about what would happen, my office management specialist was watching television. And in the middle of our conversation, she came in and ripped the door open and said, "We've all been kicked out." And I looked around the room, and ladies and gentlemen, I saw panic with my team. And so I looked around, I saw this kind of panic, and I yelled out, "Breathe." And I took a few seconds and I looked at everybody and I started giving them things to do. Consular, I need you to make a phone call to Consular Affairs. Let's start cleaning up our stuff. I'm going to make a call to Washington, so forth and so on. Then I went in my office and closed the door, and it had one of those moments. And it's difficult to react. It's difficult. I don't see anybody's faces, so I can't have your reactions. And it's a little odd and off-putting, to be honest with you, to tell these stories and not get your reactions. But I went in my office and closed the door, and I said, well, I don't know what just happened, but we got to fix this somehow. And what we did is, our number one priority is the protection of American citizens, including my own team. And I immediately started the process to send almost everybody home. And I stayed behind with my Marines, a small contingent of other officers, And we stayed there. There were 23 of us, and we stayed there for 7 weeks in defiance of Maduro's order because we did not recognize him and do not recognize him as a legitimate president of that country. Now, eventually, it got to the point where the situation was so difficult that we had to pull up and leave, and that happened in March 14th of 2019, when the U.S. government chartered a C-130 and brought us home. Now, at that point in time, we were thinking, well, how can we be most effective working with the Venezuelan people if we're not going to be there? Some people said, well, we should be in Miami, which I didn't cotton to. And some said, well, we should be in D.C., which I didn't particularly want to do. But over the course of a few months, I convinced the Secretary of State that we should open up an office here in Colombia. Now, man has walked this path before. We have an external office for Libya that's over in Tunisia. We have one for Somalia, which is in and out of Somalia, but they're really in Nairobi, Kenya. We have one for Yemen. So we've done this before. We learned from those lessons. And in August of 2019, we set up shop here at the U.S. Embassy to Colombia. And I have a small team here. No one is inside the embassy, but I still have a team that's operating inside of Venezuela who we're doing this largely from home. And I made the joke earlier that you all who were relatively new to operating by Zoom and operating remotely, we were early adapters to the Zoom craze in my office because almost everything I do virtually. Now, the foreign minister for President Guaido lives 3 blocks from me. There are 1.8 million Colombians in this country. I have the opportunity to engage on a daily basis with Venezuelans who have had to come over into Colombia, part of that almost 6 million in the diaspora now. They're members of, recently the governor of Táchira State came over, members of the National Assembly can come over, people in business. This is, and we're very active. As a matter of fact, I'll make a quick plug for my program. On Thursdays at 4:30 Caracas time, 3:30 Eastern on Facebook Live, we do a program which is kind of freewheeling. Last week I had Leopoldo Lopez and Delso Solorzano on my program to talk about the parliamentary election and repression. Next week, and you heard it here first, we won't announce it till tomorrow, but on this Thursday, we'll have President Guaido on my program for the 3rd time. And this is a way we could break into the censorship that exists in Venezuela. And that, in the time that I have, I'd like to talk a little bit about the role of the Maduro regime and how they've very systematically, cynically, and nefariously gone about dismantling the institutions of governance in that country. And the fact of the matter is that that the institutions of government do not work for the Venezuelan people. They work for a very small group of people. When they realized in 2015 that they lost the National Assembly, which was a huge surprise to them, in that election, over 70% of the people voted. The election that just happened, we calculate between 18 and 23% claimed that voted. The regime claims 30%. And even at 30%, it's not a mandate. It's the worst election, you know, in quotations, that has happened since 2005, the worst turnout. But let me go back a little bit before the events of the Sunday and just kind of lay out what this regime has been doing. When they lost this 2015 National Assembly, they quickly put through a number of Supreme Court justices. They packed the court with people that would be compliant to their will. They blocked the opposition parties from having a supermajority in the National Assembly by not allowing 3 indigenous people from Amazonas state to be seated. They created a constitutional body called the Constituent Assembly, but its only purpose is to write a new constitution. But they've used that as a shadow National Assembly in much the same way that when they lost governorships in 2016, they went through and said, well, we're going to put a protector in charge of this state because we don't trust the opposition to run things. They didn't provide any salary to any member of the National Assembly. The Supreme Court said it was in contempt. Not once has President Guaido been on television or radio inside of the country. Not one time. I have been on radio a couple of times, and as recently as 3 weeks ago, the CONATEL, which is the organization that runs their licensing, broadcasting type situation, found out that a radio station was going to interview me on live radio, and they blocked a transmission. They blocked the interview from happening. So we're dealing with a repressive regime that does the following. It uses censorship. It has undermined all the institutions. Even now, during this fraudulent parliamentary process that they just did, they used food as a weapon. They, as early as in February in 2019, you'll recall that there was a big concert on the border. We tried to bring in some humanitarian assistance. I was still in Venezuela. They said, we do not have a humanitarian crisis in this country, which we all knew was wrong. Over the course of the last couple of weeks, this regime has blocked the World Food Program from coming in. It has gone after NGOs providing school lunches to kids. And it's had a systematic attack against NGOs because they have a food program called CLAP, C-L-A-P, and they use that as a social control mechanism in the country. In other words, this weekend, Diosdado Cabello, who's an important figure, said, if you don't vote, you're not going to eat. We're taking names. You won't get your Christmas ham, which is a big thing there, and we will no longer give you subsidized food. Why is that important? In a country that's gone through over 2 years of hyperinflation, where the average monthly salary is about $1.30, but the average family of four needs $250 a month. That's $1.30 a month. So $230 a month, I think it is $250 in order to eat. So this is a repressive group. It's been called out for crimes against humanity by the United Nations and by the OAS. In fact, last year when Bachelet, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, was in the country, they tortured and murdered, assassinated Captain Acosta Rebelo. Now, I have other examples. Fernando Alban, who was a council member, a person well known to me, I knew him personally, was thrown out of this 10-story window of a building and killed when we had a member of the U.S. Congress in town. That happened in early 2019 as well. I could go through all the ways that they repress society, how they attack people for thinking differently. But just so you know, I want to point out two things, and recognizing that I've been talking a long time and I don't want to go over because I really learned a lot from y'all's questions. I want to point out just a couple of things. This all started as an attack against the political institutions most recently, this being the most recent fraud that just happened. So what they did is they stole the political parties from the rightful owners in an attempt to confuse people about who the opposition is. They've blocked every major politician from participating in elections. They just can't participate. They've been blocked from participating. And then they attempted last year in January to steal the National Assembly through a process where they paid off people $500,000 or more per person to claim that they were the new National Assembly. So right now we actually have three National Assemblies. We have the Constituent Assembly, we have the real National Assembly, and we have this fake thing called the Scorpions in Alacranes in Spanish, National Assembly. So in fact, next year, if we only have two, the legitimate one and this thing that they just pulled together, we're actually improving to some extent, I'd say. But they did this political maneuver. They went after them. They've kept them all from running. Anytime that they rent equipment to have an event, they go after the vendor of the equipment and keep it. Very nefarious. Then over the course of the last 6 months, they've done an economic maneuver with Tarek Al-Assami, who is a kingpin designated narco trafficker. They put something through called the anti-blockade law. And all this is a souped up version of what happened at the fall of the Soviet Union, which will allow people to steal that which remains in the country. In other words, to buy political support from insiders, from the military, and potentially from China, Russia, Iran, and others. And then finally, they've gone after the NGOs because they recognize that they can't control the society if they have independent actors operating. The last two things I'll say, Maduro does not have just a political problem. He has a judicial problem. He has $15 million on his head. He's indicted for narco trafficking. And he has a moral problem, which crimes against humanity, and that's in the reports from the United Nations and the Organization of American States. I'd like to close with my nod to George Kennan in the log telegram. In September, we put forward a note to the department and to others, excuse me, called a cable called The Cost of Failure. And it was, as Ambassador Shapiro, when I say it was 30 paragraphs, you'll recognize how long that is. It was a pretty deep piece. But I think what people need to recognize is that Venezuela is not just an issue and a problem for Venezuela and Venezuelans, but rather it's a clear and present danger across the hemisphere. I'm not talking about just the fact that in the age of big power competition, Russia and China are operating there. I'm not talking about just state-sponsored terror, Iran, getting cozier and cozier with Venezuela, trying to sell them weapon systems, of which they've been very overt in their desire to buy these systems. I'm not just talking about the FARC-D and ELN elements there that are operating in other illegal armed groups inside of the country, but Venezuela is also destabilizing the region because of the 6 million displaced persons across the region, also because of the vector for disease, everything from foot and mouth to measles and smallpox and tuberculosis. And this regime in particular follows something called the Foro de Sao Paulo, the Sao Paulo Forum, and their idea is to undermine democratic institutions and create illiberal democraduras, if you will, democracy dictatorships across the hemisphere. So they have actively supported the Kirchners and before in Argentina. They've actively supported political parties even in Europe, Five Stars in Italy, Podemos in Spain, the Communist Party in the Czech Republic. But they also have actively supported social unrest across Latin America. This is a country that presents a danger not only to itself, but also to the region. We have to keep that in mind. I won't go through the entire 30-paragraph think piece, but that gives you a flavor of what we're talking about. So as Ambassador Shapiro knows, I could talk an owl out of a tree, one of my favorite expressions. I want to stop there. I'd love to be able to see people if y'all are allowed to put faces up, because I feel like I'm just talking to myself and writing in my journal. If not, I understand, but I look forward to your questions, and I'm sure we're going to have a great engagement. Thank you very much.
Tony, you need to unmute. There you go.
Good afternoon, Ambassador Story. Welcome. You've generated a number of questions, so let's begin this one. In addition to Cuba and Russia, what other countries are giving political and military support to Venezuela?
So listen, Iran has certainly played an outsized role helping them with gasoline imports. In the refinery industry, they can refine 1.3 million barrels of petroleum a day, but because of their mismanagement, the theft of everything in the country, they're doing about 30,000 barrels a day. That's not enough. They continue to ship diesel, which they desperately need for the agricultural sector, to Cuba for free. Cuba's really pulling the strings here and what's happening inside of Venezuela. Russia has and China both had debt peonage relationships to some extent with Venezuela. Most of the debt to Russia has been paid off, in particular to Rosneft, which obviously is important to Putin, but they've also provided them with advanced weapon systems. Just last year, it became clear that the regime spent $208 million to update their Sukhois. This is a problem for the region because the Colombians do not have an answer for the Sukhois. In other words, the Sukhois could bomb Bogota without really there being a response. And then China has a very large $20 to $25 billion outstanding loan. They haven't given additional money to the Maduro regime, but now they are talking about providing weapon systems. And some of this has been recently out in the press, ship-to-ship missiles and what have you. So the idea of buying drones from Iran, theater ballistic missiles from Iran, advanced aviation from Russia, and possible other toys from China, I think is a wake-up call for all of us.
Mr. Ambassador, how is the U.S. helping Colombia in the crisis created by the mass migration of Venezuelans to Colombia?
Listen, this is a great question. When I was here running counter-narcotics from 2015 to 10 to 13, I have to get my days right. My job was to make life miserable for the FARC so that they would sue for peace. And I give myself a win there. I did not create liberal democracy in Afghanistan. I'll give myself a loss there. And the jury is still out. We're in the fourth quarter playing Georgia between the hedges, but we got the ball and we're driving on this whole Venezuela thing. So we'll see how my final score ends up. Listen, the U.S. Congress since 2017 has been extraordinarily generous with the American taxpayers' dollars. We've invested $1.2 billion both inside and outside of Venezuela to deal with the humanitarian crisis that's been created by the Maduro regime. The 1.8 million roughly here in Colombia, we work through international organizations inside of Venezuela and outside of Venezuela to help them as they're coming across and getting settled. Everything from food vouchers to schools, to helping them in schools and supporting the government of Colombia to deal with the economic impact that this generates. And at the end of the day, Colombia is still trying to get out of a 50-something year civil war with the FARC, and they need to secure the peace. They didn't have in their balance sheet paying for an additional 2 million citizens, all of whom are showing up under duress, a very difficult situation. But we are supporting them. We don't do direct budget support to countries. We haven't done that in decades. But we do pick up the tab in different areas, especially food and medicine and support to people as they come across. We work really closely with the United Nations and other NGOs as well.
Pressure alone hasn't yet succeeded in deposing Maduro. What incentives might help jumpstart a transition? In other words, a promise of no extradition to the United States, reducing sanctions in exchange for reforming institutions, proposing a joint transitional government.
So we launched on March the 31st, what we call the Framework for Democratic Transition, and taking lessons learned from Serbia and Panama in the 80s, looking at making an offer that we thought was generous. Unfortunately, we also have independence of action among the three branches of government in the United States, and it came out almost coincidental to the indictment against Nicolas Maduro. So it didn't quite have the impact I was hoping for. I think that's a measure of the strength of our democracy, that the judicial system does its thing and the Article 1 and Article 2 branches do theirs. Now, having said that, I continue to talk about this because it illustrates a couple of things. One, that we're not saying who needs to be in charge, but rather that the National Assembly, if you had 25% of the vote, which included the PSUV, the communist, they're not even communist, the dictatorial party, if you will, could veto each other's candidates for a transitional government, and we would begin lifting sanctions as we move forward. Now, I am from Berkeley County. I'm smart enough not to get ahead of my skis here on policy moving forward in 2021. But I believe even if President Trump had won another term, we'd be looking at mechanisms to convince people to get back to the negotiating table. Now, they've done many negotiations and all of them have failed. I believe that there've been three fundamental problems with prior negotiations. One, the wrong people were in the room. You can't just negotiate with Maduro. He's Tony Soprano in charge of various factions, and you need to have the factions in the room. Two, negotiations cannot be open-ended. They need to be focused on what I think are three key things, and I think that most people in Venezuela believe on this. Minimum conditions for elections, reestablishing an electoral calendar with anticipated presidential elections, and then guarantees. And then the third fatal flaw has been that the United States, European Union, and others have not participated in the process. The idea of having as guarantors certain people in a second room on a second floor, this is how things got through in other situations. Just allowing the Norwegians to run it or the Dominican Republic to run it, I think is probably not going to work, because at the end of the day, we hold the keys to the sanctions. Now, having said that, now you have, as I pointed out, Maduro has these three problems. One's political, that's easy enough to deal with, but then he has a narcotics trafficking problem and a morality problem, crimes against humanity. These things become more difficult over time. I do think that there'll be opportunities for us to re-engage. I believe that we should do so clear-eyed, learning our lessons from the past. We do have leverage. We have significant leverage that's being bequeathed to the next administration that I think that we can deploy in the right way to induce the right outcome. I think a bad outcome would be that this whole thing implodes, which is also possible in a country like Venezuela, where electricity, the hospital systems don't work, electricity is out most of the time, people don't have fresh water, people are going hungry. The number of people that are considered malnourished in the country, about 7 million. This is a lot of people talk about R2P, right to protect. I think this is a pretty clear case that there's a lot of suffering going on in the country at the hands of a narcissistic, cruel regime. So we'll see what the future holds. I'm not going to get too much further out in front of my skis on that one.
This next question, in a way, parallels a portion of what you were just referencing. So I feel obligated to ask it. Ms. McCoy would like to ask, is there a way to get China, Russia, Cuba, Iran, or Turkey on board to pressure Maduro? I think she's asking if there's leverage somewhere with one or more of those nation states that we can utilize.
Listen, I think when it comes to, Russia, it's a little more difficult because they thrive in chaos. I'm no Russia scholar, but they love places like Syria because they burrow in a spot like that and they can wreak havoc. And remember, their long-term plan is pretty clear, which is to undermine our institutions, democratic institutions, not just the United States, but across the world, because they believe they don't believe in the same things that we believe in. And again, I'm a child of the Cold War. I'm watching what they do, and it's pretty clear how they operate. Now, having said that, China's a different place because China, when I look at China, Cuba, Russia, I look at the Cuba issue as existential. If they don't have Venezuela, that regime would have a really hard time holding on. They're having a hard time as it is. I look at the Russia one as geostrategic. They love creating problems for us in the hemisphere. In fact, they wouldn't have a problem if we had to resort to military intervention because it would create additional problems for us in our hemisphere. So I pointed out once, the Russians, they're great chess players and they're beating us 3 ways from Sunday. Now, the Chinese are different. This is a commercial relationship, and I do think there's leverage to be had, not only in the 450 billion a year or whatever it is relationship in the United States, but also you look at what's more important to China, 20, 25 billion debt they have with Venezuela, or the $100 billion relationship they have with Brazil, the large relationship with Argentina, what they're doing in Panama, how they're operating in Mexico, and of course, the United States. I've been saying that for a long time, that there's some leverage with the Chinese there. Question is how to use it, how to deploy it, and how to deploy it smartly. I don't think there's much leverage with the Cubans. There are things that we could do. The Cubans will never believe us. I don't blame them. They're never gonna listen to us. The Russians are gonna want a quid pro quo. The Turks aren't doing as much as they could be doing, helping Maduro. They're unhelpful, but they're not spectacularly unhelpful. And Iran is Iran. I mean, this is a state sponsor of terror. They're going to continue to operate the way they operate. From my perspective, I don't think we need to wait for them to sell theater ballistic missiles to Venezuela before they've crossed the line. I believe they've already crossed the line. Now, the question becomes how they pay for crossing that line. And that's certainly beyond my pay scale sitting here on my veranda in Bogota.
Ken Fox asks, is there any good news on the future of Venezuela?
I believe in the arc of the moral universe bending towards justice. And I have to tell you that Sunday, the regime got absolutely pounded. And I got off a phone call this morning with 15 ambassadors that cover Venezuela from Colombia. Countries like New Zealand, they have to cover multiple countries from one place, but Norway, European Union countries, Israel, Australia, New Zealand, others on this call. And the statements of rejection of what transpired inside of Venezuela is very comforting to me because I think it shows that the international community will not be hoodwinked by what just transpired in Venezuela. What Maduro wants is legitimacy, and what he desperately craves is legitimacy in the lifting of sanctions, and what he's getting is none of it. Now, before we begin, we have plenty of opportunities to adjust sanctions to get them back to the negotiating table if we've learned all of our lessons from the past. Allowing Repsol, a Spanish company, to do diesel swaps. Maybe they're owed a lot of money. Certainly Reliance, Indian refiner, would love to have their hands on this oil. They're selling their oil at a $30 a barrel, 30%, excuse me, a barrel discount. So everybody wants to get involved in the game because there's a lot of money to be made. A lot of money has been stolen. Listen, just this year in Florida, the senior agent in charge of Department of Homeland Security investigations, they've confiscated $800 million of illicit gains from regime insiders. 800 million. And this, recall that this country is sitting on top of, what's it, 300 billion barrels of proven reserves. I think the number is, I can't quite remember, but much more than Saudi Arabia. It's not hard to get to. It's not great oil, but it's relatively accessible and easy to pull up. In fact, Sulphur, Louisiana and Houston, Texas are built in large regards of dealing with Venezuelan crude that came across. This is a very, very, very rich country. If left to its own devices, it will prove to be much more than a thorn in our side politically, economically, geopolitically, of course, in the region for decades. It's not another Cuba. And I don't think the Europeans are going to romanticize Venezuela to the extent that some have romanticized Cuba over the years. Nor will their regional neighbors. I mean, Colombia and Brazil. Brazil's been very strong on this. Colombia as well. Chile has been as well. Peru leading the Lima Group. I think there's good news to be had that we've managed to build a coalition of 60 countries that recognize Guaido as president. Now we'll see how things go moving forward, but we said it many times. Maduro shouldn't be allowed to strengthen his hand with yet another fraudulent election. He benefited from a fraudulent election in May of 18, and we're going to allow him to continue to benefit from fraudulent elections moving forward. I think the answer for the international community is no. In addition, and apologies for joining on here, but the consulta, a lot of people, well, why are they doing a consulta? Why are they asking for a second vote? This is kind of a popular vote. So many people tried to vote yesterday, the first day the websites were open, that it crashed the system. I think that the people inside of Venezuela are tired. They're not out demonstrating like they used to in 2017 when you had massive protests, 2015, 16. Even when I was there in the early part of 2019, massive, hundreds of thousands of people. You don't have that because people are waiting in line for gasoline. They don't have some food. They don't have medicine for their family. 6 million of them have left the country. But you are seeing the politicians reconnect with the street in a way that will be very useful. And I think that what we're entering now, or what I'm encouraging, is that they build new grassroots movements, political parties attached to civil society and others, in order to show the world that there's this internal pressure against the regime as well. The regime is not as monolithic or strong as as people would like them to believe. And sanctions take their time to work. I'm glad that we did sanctions on South Africa as long as we did. Nelson Mandela said that was the reason that things changed. I'm glad that we deployed sanctions against Libya. It worked, took time. I don't think we have as much time because of the impact that Venezuela has on the region. And I'm hopeful that it has its impacts much quicker.
Interesting. Margarita asks, in your opinion, is there any way out for Venezuela without military intervention, and what would that be?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have the luxury of having my own opinion since my first name changed yesterday to ambassador.
I knew you would say that.
But I do, what's interesting to me is you have about 12% of the population supports Maduro, about 25 or 30 now support Guaido. His numbers have come way down. But remember, he's censored. He hasn't delivered, according to people. They're tired. 60-something% are ni. They're neither Maduro nor the opposition, let's say. But the highest number of people believe that military intervention is what should happen. And I believe that putting your eggs in the military intervention basket it kind of abdicates responsibility for building a broad civil society movement that will get you to the same place. The Maidan, Hong Kong, whether or not they were successful, these are groups of people that said, ya basta, ya enough, and went out onto the streets. Again, Maduro appears strong right now, and he loves to thump his chest and say, you can't, you failed. There are a lot of people around him that recognize that unless he gets back to the negotiating table, life will never get better for them, ever. You won't have a bank account. You won't be able to travel. You don't have a credit card. And what we have to do as an international community is be a little stronger on that. Listen, I've taken the Spanish government to task pretty directly on the fact that you have Army colonels making $15 to $16 a month with their families living in Madrid and they own multiple homes. Or you have generals traveling to their farms in Panama. That's where I believe the Rio Treaty, for instance, is, that we've deployed for the first time since the 1960s, will enable us as we think about it creatively. Let's go after the repressive regime and say, you know what? You're not going to travel anywhere ever again in Latin America. We're just not going to let you. And you're not going to go to Europe. Now, they have different sets of rules there, but I do think we can construct enough additional pressure to where people inside will knock on Maduro's door and say, boss, we got to, life kind of stinks. We got to talk our way out of this. Listen, they have about $6 billion in reserves. Almost all of it is gold bars. All of their other accounts are frozen around the world. They just paid their UN dues, and that was very difficult for them to manage. They don't have the room to maneuver that they used to have. Now they'll try to say, well, and that's why, and the sanctions are why, there's so much suffering, and we need an oil for food program. Listen, I worked at the UN when we had this with Iraq, and there's a great expression that I know fellow Southerners will know. There's no education in the second kick of a mule. And I know how that mule kicks, and I don't think we need to go that route, because they're making decisions to buy weapons instead of food. They're making decisions to steal money instead of medicine. So I don't think military intervention is necessary. And listen, as a diplomat, if that were to happen, I would have failed demonstrably at my job.
Netta County, Georgia Tech. I'd like to know, what does a post-crisis Venezuela look like from your perspective? Is Venezuela so far off the deep end, socioeconomically and politically, that it could successfully recover? Do you see the Venezuelan diaspora returning?
I do, and here's why. It is the richest country in the world. And let me just leave it right there. It's got more gold, coltan, uranium, diamonds, oil, you name it. And, people talk a lot about the Marshall Plan, and they'll say, South Sudan needs a Marshall Plan. Well, that won't work in South Sudan because you have to build everything from scratch. The Marshall Plan worked at the end of World War II because we dusted off the books and said, oh, okay, this is how everything worked. Let's rebuild what you already had. That's how that worked. In the case of Venezuela, when I was there, I was going into hospitals. They had brand new in the box, radiotherapy machines for breast cancer that had never been used because they were missing one or two parts. So this isn't hard. It's going to be really expensive. And just in the oil industry to get back to 2.5 million barrels a day of production, it'll probably cost 140 billion over 10 years investment. But companies will go because oil companies go where the rock is, and the rock is in Venezuela. Now, having said that, the things that concern me, the things that we think about are how do you provide immediate relief to people who are suffering? And here's an area in which the U.S. government, we've never done a particularly good job of this. I mean, how long did it take to get air conditioners running again in Iraq, for instance, or fresh water? We have to really think this through, and we've been doing a lot of work in this area. I have a detailed plan on how to double electricity production in the country within 6 months to give a base load so that you don't have people who don't have refrigeration, or you have hospitals that don't have electricity. Those types of things. Security concerns me. The good news is, when I was a director of narcotics and law enforcement for the Western Hemisphere, we've walked this path before. Here in Colombia, worked closely in how do you extend state influence into undergoverned spaces or ungoverned spaces? And we did that in Colombia, and that's why the FARC sued for peace. We could do that. We could do that in Venezuela. In Central America, we worked in poor communities that had some of the highest murder rates per capita, 150, 200 per 100,000. And we brought those numbers down by connecting people to the police in a positive way, and a program called place-based management, place-based strategy. In Mexico, we created or helped them create police that were well vetted and non-predatory, and helped professionalize them. So I think we have a lot of lessons learned that we'll have to deploy inside of Venezuela. If somebody asked me my off the cuff number, I need $1 billion for a year for 5 years of no year money, meaning I can carry it over and I have to spend it any particular year. And it's going to take us 15, 20 years to get the place where it needs to be. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be a slog. As hard as I work now, and I'm from home today. It's a holiday here today. I'm going to work a lot harder trying to help Venezuelans rebuild their institutions. Because remember, all these institutions have been destroyed. A quick story, and then I'll stop. I was saving sea turtles for the State Department. I love my job. I've got to do so many cool things. I worked on shrimp boats as a kid in South Carolina. So I did that for 2 years, traveling the world and saving sea turtles. And I was in Venezuela, and this was back in 2004 or 5. And they had just had a recall referendum for Chavez. And this is where Ambassador Shapiro tell me I'm wrong, but this is my memory. It could have been 2007. I could have gone back. And people who voted against Chavez, well, not a recall referendum. It was a referendum on Chavez. They voted against him in some way to expand his powers. Remember, so. And I went to the Ministry of Fisheries, and I was with a Venezuelan from the embassy who was going in with me to talk to them about their shrimp fishery. And I could see in the reflection of a poster of Chavez that she was going through what was called La Lista Tascon to see who had voted against Chavez. And she found his name and refused to allow him in the building. Okay, that's just one little vignette. But now we're talking about decades of institutions where if you're not in the inner circle, you don't get a job, you don't get food, you don't get access to medicine, you can't get a passport, you can't. All that has to be rebuilt, and you have to rebuild trust in institutions, which is why no matter where you are in the world, attacks against institutions are nefarious, insidious, and really are dangerous to democracies.
While I'm waiting for further questions, I have one of my own.
All right. I got all political just then. Y'all don't burn me.
Yeah, and by the way, I didn't hear Ambassador Shapiro correcting you, so you obviously must have been correct in what you just stated.
He's just being kind. He's being kind.
Yeah, and you're being diplomatic. Well, I'm just wondering, how has COVID-19 impacted on Venezuela and impacted on the Venezuelan relationship with its neighboring nation states, Colombia, and so on? How is that working out?
So they closed down their border, and they do that repeatedly. None of the data coming out of Venezuela is accurate. We just supported a CNN crew from the UK who was in there, just among us chickens, by the way. Apologies. I'm always a little loose-lipped with this stuff, but just giving them ideas on what to do. If you haven't seen their reporting, it just came out today, if I'm not mistaken, about the hospital situation and COVID-19 in Venezuela. I highly recommend it. Extraordinary reporting. There's a kind of a video report and then a written report. But the numbers are definitely much higher than the Venezuelans are letting on. The Venezuelans have attempted to say that returning Venezuelans were carrying the disease into Venezuela. They put those Venezuelans under very austere circumstances, very difficult. How they treated them was really inhumane. I spoke to people who were put through a process where they were stuck in a room with no water, no running water, and it really had just a difficult couple of weeks. They've closed the border between the two countries, and it looks as if at the end of this year, unlike the end of last year, you had 40 or 50,000 Venezuelans go back into Venezuela for the holidays. This year, we're tracking potentially 250,000 Venezuelans fleeing the country right at the end of the year. And they're coming out much worse than they did before. So it certainly has an impact, again, because they're using resources of the Colombians or the Peruvians or the Ecuadorians or what have you. And you do have these moments of let's say, xenophobia of some extent that happen. And I'm concerned. I'm certainly concerned by that.
Yes, the Soviets had their own Komsomol schools where they began to brainwash their children. They took them away from Stalin and company, took them away from their parents and so on. And do you see anything like that occurring in Venezuela in some effort to idealize Maduro, perhaps with the Cuban imprint, since they have a great deal of the Marxist blood flowing through them?
Not yet, but they have changed the curriculum. They have local schools, and then they have kind of almost, if you're an insider school, some get lunch, some don't get lunch, but they have changed the curriculum to some extent. But really what's even worse than that, you don't have teachers willing to show up to work anymore because it costs them. I went to schools, for instance, in Margarita Island. I went to schools in Maracaibo and Zulia. The teachers quit going because it cost them more to get to the school than they were in a day than they were paid for the month. So what you really have is between malnutrition and the lack of real education happening in the country, you have you're having a lost generation of people who, because of malnutrition, they've had cognitive impacts, and then because they're really not getting an education at all, they're not prepared for the 21st century. That's why when I think about how long it takes, I think about a generational effort to help rebuild institutions and rebuild society in Venezuela. It's going to be long, expensive, and difficult.
Interesting. Not long ago, a small group of Americans took it upon themselves to topple Maduro, or at least made that effort. They failed. What is their status, and is our government doing anything to get their release that you know of?
So when I mentioned earlier that the Supreme Court in Venezuela was handpicked to do whatever it is that Maduro wanted them to do, let me give you an example of how that is. 5 American citizens and 1 permanent resident, executives of Citgo, were called back in 2017 to Caracas for a board meeting, and they were arrested for crimes that were never really clear, corruption. 3 years later, after never having an opportunity to defend themselves, they were sentenced to between 8 and 13 years each on Thanksgiving Day. Pretty clear signal, if you ask me. Those inside the regime assure me that it was merely coincidental. I don't believe in coincidence. 3 years to get a trial. Denman and Barry, the 2 former Special Forces office members who took it upon themselves, working through a number of shadowy things, were tried and convicted to 20 years each within weeks. And I want to be clear on a couple of things. Maduro has publicly stated that I was the intellectual author of this. I'm not. Unfortunately, there was an article called "The Steely Huntsman" that came out about me. I do hunt and fish, and I think it got in Maduro's head somehow. I wasn't involved. The U.S. government wasn't involved. Didn't know anything about it. I'm quite convinced, however, that when this is all said and done, that it would be shown to be a Cuban operation run by G2, and that these gentlemen didn't realize what they were getting into. If they did, why would they be wearing flip-flops and shorts and T-shirts, and why would they carry their Southcom cards and their passports? I mean, listen, I did 477 missions in Afghanistan outside the wire on my base in southeastern Afghanistan. I didn't carry all that stuff with me. I didn't carry pictures of my family, it doesn't make any sense. Not to mention the fact that it was announced in advance by Diaz de Cabello that something was happening. He announced where it was happening. And then the money person that we've identified, Franklin Duran, was convicted of being an undocumented agent of Chavez in the United States. He was caught carrying $800,000 to the Kirchner family in Argentina during one of their political campaigns. And he has such bad luck that he loaned his airplane to somebody to fly back and forth from the United States with these gentlemen from Colombia to the United States. That tells me that this whole thing was built by the Maduro regime. I've been very clear publicly on this. The Colombian government is going through their legal processes against Venezuelans that were involved here. Again, countries that are democracies, there's a rhythm to judicial action that the executive branch doesn't change, and that's what happens in Colombia or the United States.
How effective is the Lima Group, and has Mexico rejoined it? If not, why not?
So Mexico is still in, Argentina as well.
Uh-huh.
They did not vote on the statement condemning the election. To be charitable, I believe, and I work closely with both the Argentine and Mexican missions inside of Venezuela. I believe they're trying to carve out a little bit of space of being a neutral actor. Unfortunately, from my perspective, if you throw people out of a building 10th story window, if you torture or murder somebody, if you force displace 6 million people, if you use repression or use food as a weapon, it's a little hard to be neutral. I don't think they should be neutral, but I understand what they're trying to do is carve out a space where if there is a negotiation, those two countries can serve perhaps as honest brokers with the Maduro regime.
In the beginning of this year, Bloomberg reported that Elliott Abrams claimed the U.S. underestimated the importance of Cuban and Russian support for Maduro. If sanctions are not working, then what other viable options do we have to undercut the influence and their influence in this regime?
So I don't think that I ever underestimated the Cubans and the Russians and others. I don't think Elliot did either. Perhaps he we do so many of these speaking engagements. We have a tendency to say things. I don't think that we should say the sanctions aren't working. You now have oil production of 300,000, 350,000 barrels a day. We've cut off most of their access to funding, which they were using to repress their society. As I stated, I don't think at the end of 2 years, should we have said, well, the apartheid regime doesn't appear to be changing, we should stop. And I think that history has proven that we did the right thing in the 80s to continue at great cost to the US as well. I mean, it had an impact on our economy, a great cost to say no. There's such things as objective truth, and there's such things as moral right. And here's a case where I think that we're in the right position. Now that we have this leverage, we can use it, and we should be smart about using the leverage. And I think that after 12 o'clock on the 20th of January, we'll start thinking through a little bit about how to use that leverage. But I disagree with the basis of the question that they haven't been successful. They've been extraordinarily successful. We've completely isolated them. Listen, if you're using a Greek shipping company with a boat owned by a 22-year-old Mexican who's never owned a boat before, to do ship-to-ship transfers off of Malaysia to launder through Singapore to get to China, you're not winning. I mean, you're kind of losing, right? And we play whack-a-mole. We have a couple of more OFAC things coming out this week. You'll see on Friday, but they're not. It's not like they've broken the code. They're really having a hard time with our sanctions. Now the question becomes, how do we keep that and keep that pressure on them and also alleviate suffering inside of Venezuela? We gotta figure that out. I wouldn't lift sanction 1 until they allowed the World Food Program to operate freely inside of Venezuela.
I just take a point of personal privilege to just quickly say to you that I think I can speak for our audience. You have not left us with the impression that you underestimate anything happening throughout that region, and we appreciate it. So make that, I'm not saying this is the official position, but I have a feeling we all feel that way, just for the record.
Tony, unlike a lot of people, I went to public schools in South Carolina. When I walk into the room, I don't think I'm the smartest person in the room. I'm paying attention.
I don't know. They're still talking about you in Monk Corner, so I don't know if that's so. At any rate, it has been a truly an honor and a pleasure to have you as our guest. The program committee wishes you great success in your position as ambassador to Venezuela and continued good health for you and your family. We hope and pray that you remain immune to COVID-19. And we certainly hope the day is near when we have a free Venezuela. So now, Ambassador Story, I have the pleasure of leaving you with Ambassador Shapiro, who has a few words for you. Ambassador Shapiro.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Ambassador Story, how are you?
Great, Ambassador Shapiro. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be on this with you. And I don't want to take too long because it's gone on so long, but I want to really thank you. We've had ambassadors in Venezuela since 1819. Of that group, I think there are only two who know how to say the word OIL properly, and that's you and me. There's a small club of 9 living former ambassadors. Want to keep that group going for a long time. And we feel a connection to the current ambassador. So it's an honor to Jimmy Story to have you join this group. I just got a couple of quick comments, and I apologize to the people in the audience. And it just strikes me that Hugo Chavez dominated every conversation, every news article from certainly 1998 until his death in 2013. He was a demagogue with great communication skills whose policies demonstrably, objectively, were unworkable and were failing. Turned Venezuela from a country that produced actually 3.2 million barrels a day when I arrived to right now they're producing somewhere around 350,000 barrels a day. So that's a huge drop. That's the level of oil that Venezuela produced in 1929. And with Venezuela importing gasoline from Iran, it strikes me, and this just, that Chavismo is not so much an ideology, but a religion with devotion to the martyred leader, Hugo Chavez. And it's amazing to me that the cult of Chavez lives on 8 years later, even as the country has become a dystopian nightmare. So these are my questions, which I don't expect you to answer, because I don't think we have time. But number one is how long does this cult of Chavez endure? I mean, what's the half-life of admiration for this guy who destroyed the company and brought them Nicolas Maduro and the other cronies that you were talking about? And the second one for all of us to consider is how the policy is going to change in a few weeks in the Biden administration. What will be different? And you cannot comment on this, by the way, since you're a U.S. government employee and you're going to work just as hard for the next administration as you have for this administration and the one before that. But it strikes me, not you and not our team in the embassy in Caracas and Bogota, but the political level, especially in Florida, advising the president, left open that hope and sort of nourished the hope that there would be a U.S. military intervention. Even though it was quite clear in the Trump administration, there was not going to be one, but they left that open for Venezuelan opposition to Maduro and to Chavismo to think would help them. And I could not agree with you more what you said earlier about it's Venezuelans who are going to have to solve this problem in Venezuela. and that they've got to figure out to do it. And that in fact, the easy way out is for them to ask us to solve their problem for them. And that's the challenge facing the incoming administration and the incoming Secretary of State, National Security Advisor. It's a challenge you're gonna deal with in the new administration, and it is just going to be difficult. And of course, while all this is going on, the people who are suffering, as you so eloquently laid out, are the people of Venezuela, who are just in the worst possible circumstances imaginable. So I'm going to stop there. I don't know if you want to respond to any of that, or you and I want to chat back and forth. I don't know what Tony's going to allow us to do.
Well, I'd like to say one thing to that. You're exactly right. And I remember I was climbing Avila, the mountain in Caracas in February of 19 with Enrique Capriles. And people would see Enrique and talk to him, and then they would recognize me. I had a hat on, and they would say something. I couldn't quite make out what it was. And they kept saying this to me as we climbed up. And then Enrique looked at me and said, "They're calling you the emancipator."
Oh.
And I said, "We got a problem. That ain't my job." And, you've got to build that movement internal, and we can help, and we will continue to help. And I'm going to make a shameless plug for y'all to listen to my programs on Thursdays at 3:30 Eastern on Facebook Live. And that's kind of one of the ways that we help, that we try to break through censorship, and we talk to people. And I take questions from Chavistas, but you're right. And I do think, though, policy wise, there'll be some adjustments and shifts. It'll take 5 or 6 months, as you well know, to get there. But because of the moral problems that you have with crimes against humanity, the narcotics trafficking problems, it's not just a political issue. I don't think we'll have 180 degree, but we'll see. And as you said, I've worked now. This will be my 5th administration or 6th administration, and as professional diplomats, as you well know, we represent the American people. We work for the executive branch, and we do our job as professionals. So a lot of hard work ahead of us, and I definitely look forward to picking your brain over time, Ambassador Shapiro, as I always have, and really appreciate your friendship.
Well, thank you so much. I'm proud to have you there as Ambassador to Venezuela, and I think we all should be. Thank you so much. And I want to thank ACR for letting me appear. Got some of our members are World Affairs Council members, also ACIR members. They can't get enough talking about this, and I take my hat off to them. And we've got a program tomorrow, and I'm going to see y'all tomorrow with Princess Rima, the ambassador of Saudi Arabia to the United States. So cool.
Nice.
Thank you. This has been great. Jimmy, congratulations to you. Give my best to your family.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Again, thank you very much, both of you. I appreciated the comments that both you and Ambassador Shapiro mentioned about the people having to make the decisions. I think one of the great failings that we have in foreign policy thinking, that sometimes even permeates our government, is that somehow we can fix a problem that people abroad should be fixing for themselves. You don't create democracies. People create their own democracies, and they have their own flavor for the kind of democracies they create. And you just can't build it from the outside. You can help, but you can't build it. I want to thank again Ambassador Shapiro for your thoughts, but Ambassador Story, I really appreciated this sort of very thoughtful, wide-ranging commentary that you had, and your very frank comments during the question and answer period. Before I close, I do also want to take a minute to introduce 2 new members of the Atlantic Council on International Relations Board. A couple of meetings ago, we introduced Shilpi Ganguly as our Director of Information Technology, and Almer Samiri as our Director of Human Resources. We now add to our board Galina Alexenko, who joined the board as our Director of Membership Services. Galina has a background as an economist, has worked for the Federal Reserve Bank for over 6 years and is currently managing director and senior economist with CoStar. Our second addition is Elena. She goes by Lena Bondell, who joined as our chief financial officer. Elena has had a busy career teaching Russian and English as second languages and is now completing her studies as a CPA and will assume a position in January with Deloitte. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been ACIR's pleasure to have you join us today. We hope that each and every one of you and your family, your friends are healthy and well and safe during this COVID-19 devil. For your own safety and health, please continue to wear your masks and social distance as required. Again, thanks for joining us. We wish you a very, very happy holiday season and good health and great happiness in the new year. From Atlanta and ACIR, good afternoon.